It was a quiet morning in Elmwood Heights when Deborah, the self-appointed guardian of her neighborhood, spotted an unfamiliar black man parked outside her neighbor's house. She is convinced herself that the man is a threat. She calls the police, accusing him of trespassing. But when the truth is revealed, her world is turned upside down. What happens next is a powerful lesson that can change everything. Before we dive into the story, let us know from where you're listening to. We love to hear, so comment. The sun rose high over Elmwood Heights, casting a golden glow on its tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns. It was the kind of place where everything seemed orderly, where the hum of lawnmowers blended with the chatter of joggers and children's laughter. Deborah Marshall loved her mornings here, especially when she could stand on her porch, sipping coffee and watching over what she considered her domain. She prided herself on being the neighborhood's unofficial guardian, ensuring everything stayed right. For Deborah, right meant familiar faces, clean streets, and no disruptions. On this particular morning, as Deborah watered her flower beds, a sleek black SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac. It parked in front of the two-story house across the street, the one with the white shutters that belonged to Rachel, a young woman Deborah only vaguely knew. Deborah squinted. A man stepped out of the SUV, a tall, well-dressed black man. He wore a crisp button-up shirt, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement as he stood by the vehicle. Deborah frowned, her watering can forgotten. She didn't recognize him. He didn't look like a delivery driver, nor was he someone Deborah had seen in the neighborhood before. He leaned against the car, glancing at his watch, as if waiting for something or someone. Her stomach twisted. A stranger? Here? In Elmwood Heights? Her mind raced. It wasn't just unfamiliarity. It was a gnawing feeling of unease. This was her neighborhood, and strangers had no business lingering on their quiet street. Her sense of duty as the self-appointed protector flared. Setting her watering can down with a thud, she marched across the street, determination hardening her expression with every step. Deborah's sneakers scuffed louder against the asphalt as her steps quickened, her frustration fueling each stride. Her fingers itched to grip her phone even before she reached him, just in case. The man was standing too casually, too calmly, for her liking. She glanced at the shiny black SUV parked neatly by the curb, its tinted windows making her more suspicious. Who did he think he was, showing up here like this? And why wasn't he at least trying to explain himself? The man noticed her approach and straightened up slightly, slipping his phone into his pocket. His calm demeanor, far from disarming her, only deepened her resolve. His face was neutral, a faint, polite smile curving his lips as if to say he had all the time in the world. Deborah's grip tightened on the strap of her gardening gloves as she called out, sharper than she intended, "Excuse me." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something unreadable. Surprise, perhaps, or mild annoyance. "Yes?" he asked, his voice steady, betraying neither impatience nor fear. "Can I help you?" Deborah's heart raced, but she masked it with a frown. Crossing her arms tightly, she stood at a slight angle to him, as if shielding herself. "What are you doing here?" "This is a private neighborhood," she said, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the morning. "People don't just park wherever they feel like it." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. He seemed to study her for a moment before replying. "I'm waiting for someone," he said simply, his voice even. "I'm not bothering anyone." The neutrality in his tone only fueled Deborah's frustration. She expected nervous stammering or a quick explanation, something to acknowledge her authority as a neighborhood resident. Instead, his composure made her feel dismissed, as though her concerns were unimportant. "Waiting for someone? Who?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she gestured vaguely toward the cul-de-sac. "We don't have random cars showing up here. This isn't some parking lot." The man didn't flinch. Instead, his lips pressed together briefly, and his eyebrows lifted slightly before he replied. "I'm here to pick up Rachel," he said, motioning with a nod toward the house behind him. "She's expecting me." Deborah blinked, her mind briefly catching on the name. Rachel. She knew her in passing, a polite, quiet woman who had moved into the neighborhood a year ago. But that wasn't enough to reassure Deborah. "That's nice," Deborah said, her voice tight. "But I don't know you, and I don't know what your real intentions are." She stepped closer, her chin lifting slightly as if to emphasize her authority. "This is a safe neighborhood, and we don't need strangers hanging around." The man drew a slow breath, his calm demeanor unbroken. "Ma'am, I'm parked on a public street. I'm not trespassing." Deborah felt her temper flare at his calmness. His tone carried no apology, no effort to mollify her. "I don't care if you're on the street," she snapped. "You're making people uncomfortable." The man's gaze swept the empty cul-de-sac before returning to hers. "People," he said with a faint edge of disbelief. "I don't see anyone else out here." Deborah opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of a door creaking open interrupted her. She turned to see Rachel stepping out of her house, pulling a small rolling suitcase behind her. Her face lit up when her eyes landed on the man. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," Rachel called cheerfully, hurrying down the front steps. "Thanks for coming to get me." Deborah's irritation spiked. "Rachel," she barked, her tone sharp enough to stop the younger woman in her tracks. "Do you know this man?" She gestured toward him as if he were a stray dog. "He's been lingering here like he has no business in this neighborhood." Rachel's cheerful expression faltered, confusion flashing across her face. "Of course, I know him," she said, her voice cautious now. "He's I don't care who he says he is." Deborah cut her off, her voice rising with indignation. "This isn't normal. I'm calling the police." Rachel's eyes widened in horror. "Wait, what? No, you don't need to do that." But Deborah was already pulling out her phone, her fingers trembling as she punched in the numbers. She turned her back on Rachel and Mr. Grant, speaking into the receiver with urgency. "Yes, hello. I'm at Elmwood Heights. There's a man parked in front of my neighbor's house. He's acting suspicious and might be trespassing. Can you send someone over?" Behind her, Rachel's protests grew louder. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "He's not trespassing." The man, Mr. Grant, apparently, remained calm, though his lips pressed into a thin line. He raised his hand slightly, his voice level as he addressed Deborah. "Ma'am, there's no need for this. I assure you, I'm not doing anything wrong." Deborah turned back to him, her chin lifting in defiance. "The police will sort this out," she said firmly. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about." Rachel groaned audibly, throwing her hands in the air. "You're going to regret this," she muttered, her voice tinged with exasperation. It didn't take long for the sound of sirens to pierce the air, cutting through the otherwise peaceful morning. A patrol car pulled into the cul-de-sac, its flashing lights drawing the attention of neighbors. Curtains parted, and a few people stepped out onto their porches, curiosity etched on their faces. Deborah stood tall as the two officers exited their vehicle. The younger officer scanned the area, while the older one approached Deborah, his expression professional but cautious. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person," he asked. Deborah pointed directly at Mr. Grant, who remained standing by his SUV, his posture relaxed but alert. "Yes, officers. That man has been loitering here. He doesn't live in this neighborhood, and I'm concerned he's up to something." The officers exchanged a glance before the older one approached Mr. Grant. "Sir, can you tell us what you're doing here?" "Of course," Mr. Grant said calmly, extending his hand slightly in a gesture of cooperation. "I'm here to pick up my tenant, Rachel. She lives in that house," he said, gesturing toward the property behind him. "She can confirm everything." Rachel stepped forward, her arms crossed and her face flushed with anger. "This is my landlord, Mr. Grant. He's here because I asked him to pick me up. He hasn't done anything wrong." The younger officer turned to Deborah, his tone measured. "Ma'am, do you have any reason to believe this man is a threat?" Deborah hesitated, her confidence wavering under the officer's scrutiny. I didn't recognize him, and he was just standing there, looking suspicious." "Suspicious how?" the older officer pressed, his tone growing firmer. Deborah faltered. "Well, he doesn't look like he belongs here." The officers exchanged another glance, this one laden with unspoken meaning. The younger one stepped back, clearly growing impatient with the situation. The older officer sighed, turning back to Mr. Grant. "Sir, We appreciate your cooperation. Can you confirm you're the landlord of this property? Mr. Grant nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. Yes, officer. I'm the property owner, and Rachel is one of my tenants. I was here simply to pick her up, as she requested. The officer raised an eyebrow, considering his words. He glanced at Rachel, who gave a firm nod. It's true, she said. He's my landlord. The younger officer tapped something into his tablet, verifying Mr. Grant's information. After a moment, he looked up, his expression neutral, but with a hint of bemusement. It checks out. Mr. Terrence Grant is the registered owner of this property, along with several others in this neighborhood. Deborah's mouth fell open. Wait, what? Mr. Grant turned to her now, his gaze steady but not unkind. Yes, ma'am. I'm your landlord, too. The words landed like a thunderclap. Deborah stared at him, her face going pale as the full weight of her mistake sank in. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The neighbors, now gathered in small clusters on their porches, began murmuring loudly among themselves. Some pulled out their phones to record the moment. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. The younger one gave a slight shake of his head, his expression suggesting he had seen far too many calls like this one. Ma'am, the older officer said, his tone now tinged with exasperation. It seems this was all a misunderstanding. Mr. Grant has every right to be here. There's no crime being committed. Deborah tried to recover, but her words stumbled over each other. I didn't know. I thought. What did you think? Rachel interrupted, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. That a black man in this neighborhood had to be up to no good? Deborah's face turned crimson. She opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The neighbors were no longer whispering. They were outright chuckling, shaking their heads, and recording videos. The older officer stepped back, addressing the growing crowd. All right, folks, let's clear out. There's nothing to see here. Turning to Mr. Grant, he added, Sorry for the trouble, sir. No problem, officer. Mr. Grant replied with a small nod. I appreciate your professionalism. The officers returned to their car, the younger one giving Deborah a lingering glance of disapproval before driving off. The crowd lingered for a moment longer, soaking in the spectacle, before slowly dispersing. Deborah stood frozen, her arms limp at her sides, as the truth of the situation settled over her. Mr. Grant looked at her one last time, his expression unreadable. Have a good day, ma'am, he said simply before turning to Rachel. Ready to go? Rachel gave Deborah a withering glance before following Mr. Grant to the car. As the SUV pulled away, Deborah remained rooted to the spot, the laughter and whispers of her neighbors echoing in her ears. The house felt unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that allowed thoughts to echo louder than they should. Deborah sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The events of the day looped relentlessly in her mind. The sirens, the officers' skeptical glances, the murmurs of her neighbors, and the composed yet cutting words of Mr. Grant. Her cheeks burned again at the memory of him saying, I'm your landlord, too. Deborah buried her face in her hands, her breathing uneven. She prided herself on being a good neighbor, someone who looked out for others. But today, her actions had exposed something ugly, something she could no longer ignore. She had let her assumptions dictate her actions, and in doing so, she had humiliated herself and disrespected a man who had done nothing wrong. She reached for her phone, dreading what she already knew she'd find. Videos of the incident had already surfaced on social media. One particularly popular clip, taken from a neighbor's porch, captured her sharp accusations, the arrival of the police, and the moment the officers revealed Mr. Grant's identity. ACH comment felt like a slap. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't that kind of person, but the truth was staring her in the face. Her actions spoke louder than her intentions. Whether or not she thought of herself as prejudiced didn't matter. She had acted on an assumption based solely on appearance, and there was no excusing it. She sighed, setting the phone down. As much as she wanted to crawl into bed and forget the day had ever happened, she couldn't. She owed Mr. Grant, Terrence, she corrected herself, an apology, a real one, and not just to clear her name in the eyes of her neighbors, but because she knew it was the right thing to do. The next morning, Deborah stood outside Rachel's house, clutching a small box of pastries from the local bakery. She had debated what to say a dozen times, each version sounding more hollow than the last. Now, as she raised her hand to knock on the door, her heart pounded. The door opened, and there he was, Terrence Grant, dressed casually in a navy sweater and jeans. His expression was neutral, his eyes unreadable. Deborah swallowed hard. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Terrence crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "No, not at all," he said evenly. "What can I do for you?" Deborah held out the box, her hands shaking. "I brought these as a peace offering," she said. "But more importantly, I came to apologize. For everything." He didn't take the box, though his expression softened slightly. "I appreciate the gesture," Terrence said, his tone measured. "But an apology is more important than pastries." "Go ahead." Deborah felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I judged you unfairly," she began, her voice trembling. "I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume. I let my fear and my ignorance get the better of me. What I did was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you." Terrence's expression didn't change, but he shifted his stance slightly, as if considering her words. Deborah hurried to continue. "I've been replaying everything in my mind, and I see now how damaging my actions could have been. I didn't just disrespect you. I disrespected myself, my neighbors, and the kind of community I want to be a part of." She hesitated, the words heavy on her tongue. "I'm ashamed of what I did. I truly am." Terrence nodded slowly, his arms still crossed. "I won't lie to you, Deborah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What you did hurt. You called the police on me because I didn't look like someone who belonged here. Do you know how dangerous that could have been for me?" Deborah's face flushed, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And that's what terrifies me the most. I've seen stories about situations like this, and I thought I'd never do something like that. But I did. I became exactly the kind of person I always thought I was against." Terrence let her words hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Acknowledging it is a good start," he said. "But an apology isn't the end of this. It's what you do next that matters." Deborah nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes. "I know. I want to learn from this. I've already started reading about bias and taking steps to educate myself. I know it won't undo what I did, but I want to be better." Terrence finally uncrossed his arms, his posture relaxing slightly. "It sounds like you're taking this seriously," he said. "That's good. But understand that trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It takes time and effort." "I understand," Deborah said quickly, "and I'm willing to put in that effort." Terrence gave her a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "All right. Apology accepted. And thank you for coming here to say it in person." Deborah exhaled, the weight of his words lifting some of the guilt pressing on her chest. She held out the box of pastries again, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "Now, can I at least leave you these?" Terrence chuckled softly, finally taking the box from her hands. "Fine. I'm not one to turn down pastries." Deborah smiled, a genuine one this time. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me the chance to make things right." "Just keep working on yourself," Terrence said, his tone lighter now. "And maybe, next time we meet, it won't be under such dramatic circumstances." Deborah nodded, a blush creeping into her cheeks. "Fair enough," she said. "Have a good day, Mr. Grant." "You too, Deborah," he replied before stepping back into the house and closing the door gently. Deborah walked back to her own house, feeling a mix of relief and determination. The apology had been a step, but it wasn't the end. That evening, she signed up for a community workshop on unconscious bias and began researching organizations that focused on fostering inclusivity. She also made an effort to reconnect with her neighbors, particularly those she hadn't taken the time to know before. She approached Rachel later that week, offering her another heartfelt apology and asking if there was anything she could do to make up for the embarrassment she had caused. Rachel, though wary at first, eventually accepted her sincerity. Word of Deborah's efforts began to spread. Some neighbors welcomed her change of heart, while others remained skeptical. Deborah didn't mind. She knew actions spoke louder than words, and she was determined to prove herself through consistent effort. A month later, Terrence hosted a community barbecue at one of his properties, inviting all the tenants and neighbors to come together. Deborah hesitated before deciding to attend, unsure how she would be received. But as she arrived with a dish of homemade potato salad, she noticed smiles and warm greetings from some of the people she had reached out to in the weeks prior. Terrence spotted her and waved her over. "Glad you could make it," he said warmly. Deborah smiled nervously. "Thank you for inviting me." The barbecue was a success, with laughter and conversations filling the yard. Deborah found herself talking to neighbors she had never truly engaged with before, learning about their lives and experiences. It was humbling, and it made her realize how much she had missed by letting her assumptions cloud her perspective. As the evening wound down, Deborah found herself sitting near Terrence. "This is wonderful," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "Thank you for organizing it." "It's what a community should look like," Terrence said, smiling. "And it's good to see everyone coming together." Deborah nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. "I still have a lot to learn," she admitted, "but I'm grateful for the chance to do better." Terrence raised his glass. "To progress," he said. Deborah clinked her glass against his. "To progress." Deborah's story reminds us that assumptions can have serious consequences, but redemption begins with accountability and a willingness to change. It's not about being perfect, it's about striving to do better every day. Thank you so much for being until here with us. If you like our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more story, and we will see you in the next video.